Emma Reynolds had been tracking animals in the Pacific Northwest for most of her life. As a wildlife biologist specializing in large mammal behavior, she had studied everything from black bears to mountain lions, developing a reputation as one of the best trackers in Washington state. But nothing in her 20 years of experience had prepared her for what she discovered on that rainy morning in the Olympic National Forest. The storm had been biblical in its intensity. For 3 days straight, rain had pounded the ancient forest, winds howling through the towering cedars and Douglas firs with enough force to snap branches as thick as a man's thigh. Roads flooded, power lines went down, and the residents of the small logging town of Elkhorn had huddled in their homes, waiting for nature's fury to subside. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma had ridden out the storm in her small cabin on the outskirts of town. As the regional wildlife specialist for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, she had been anxiously monitoring reports of flash flooding and landslides, concerned about the impact on the local ecosystem. When the rain finally stopped and the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, she wasted no time in heading out to assess the damage. Her destination was the Clearwater Basin, a remote area of old-growth forest that served as crucial habitat for Roosevelt elk and other protected species. Reports had come in of a significant landslide that had potentially altered the course of a salmon-spawning stream. If true, the environmental impact could be severe. Emma's forest green department truck bounced over the rutted logging road, its tires splashing through puddles that in some cases were deep enough to reach the axles. She drove with the practiced ease of someone who knew these back roads intimately, her sharp eyes constantly scanning the forest around her for signs of wildlife or damage. "What a mess," she muttered to herself, slowing to navigate around a fallen hemlock that partially blocked the road. The storm had left its mark everywhere she looked: uprooted trees, eroded banks, debris scattered across the landscape. Nature's way of reminding humans who really held the power in these ancient woods. After nearly an hour of careful driving, Emma reached the end of the road. From here, she would need to continue on foot. She parked her truck in a small clearing, grabbed her backpack filled with survey equipment, and checked that her sidearm was secure in its holster, a precaution against the occasional aggressive cougar or bear. With a GPS unit in hand and her camera slung around her neck, Emma set off into the forest. The air smelled fresh and clean after the storm, rich with the scents of wet earth, pine resin, and decaying vegetation. Despite the destruction visible all around, there was something rejuvenating about being in the forest after a major weather event. It was as if the ecosystem had been reset, allowing Emma to witness the very beginning of the natural recovery process. She made good progress along the muddy trail, carefully documenting signs of storm damage for her report. The forest was unusually quiet, the wildlife still cautious after the tumult of the past few days. Only the occasional call of a raven or the distant tap of a woodpecker broke the silence. After about 2 miles of hiking, Emma reached the site of the reported landslide. The damage was significant. A massive section of the hillside had given way, sending tons of soil, rocks, and trees crashing down into the valley below. The debris had indeed altered the course of Clearwater Creek, creating a natural dam that was already forming a small pond. "This is going to be a problem," Emma said aloud, surveying the scene with a professional eye. She took out her camera and began capturing images of the landslide and the affected creek, making notes on her waterproof notepad about potential impacts on the salmon population and possible mitigation strategies. She was so absorbed in her work that at first she didn't notice the strange impressions in the mud near the edge of the newly formed pond. It wasn't until she had completed her initial survey and was preparing to take soil samples that something caught her eye. A series of depressions in the soft earth, partially filled with water. Emma froze, her training immediately kicking in. Years of tracking had taught her to notice patterns in nature, to distinguish between the random and the deliberate. These depressions weren't random. They formed a line, evenly spaced, like footprints. But they were unlike any footprints she had ever seen. Slowly, methodically, Emma approached the first impression. It was massive, easily 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. The shape was vaguely humanoid, with what appeared to be 5-toe impressions at the front, but the size was impossible for any human foot. She knelt down, careful not to disturb the print, and placed her own boot beside it for scale. Her size 9 hiking boot looked like a child's footprint next to the massive impression. "What the hell?" she whispered, her scientific mind racing through possibilities. Bear? No, the shape was all wrong, and bears didn't walk on their hind legs for extended periods. Hoax? Possible, but they were in an extremely remote location, miles from the nearest road, and the prints showed signs of natural formation. The way the mud had been displaced suggested genuine weight and pressure, not artificial creation. Emma's heart rate quickened as she followed the trail of prints with her eyes. They emerged from the forest on one side of the landslide, crossed the newly exposed earth, and disappeared back into the trees on the other side. Whatever had made these tracks had walked through here very recently, likely just after the storm subsided. With growing excitement and a touch of trepidation, Emma began to document the discovery. She photographed each print individually, using her boot and a measuring tape for scale. She made detailed sketches in her notebook, noting the depth, stride length, and distinctive features of each impression. This was unlike anything she had encountered in her professional career. As a scientist, Emma had always maintained a healthy skepticism about cryptid legends. The Pacific Northwest was rife with stories of Sasquatch or Bigfoot, a supposed ape-like creature that roamed the remote forests of the region. Emma had always attributed these tales to misidentified bears, overactive imaginations, or deliberate hoaxes. But standing here, looking at these enormous, unmistakably bipedal footprints, she felt her skepticism wavering. "Get a grip, Reynolds," she muttered to herself, trying to maintain scientific objectivity. There's a logical explanation for this. But what if there wasn't? What if the explanation was exactly what folklore had suggested for generations? The thought sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the damp chill in the air. After thoroughly documenting the prints near the landslide, Emma decided to follow the trail into the forest. Professional curiosity overrode caution. Whatever had made these prints was long gone, judging by the slight deterioration of the impressions from the morning's light rain. Besides, this could be a major scientific discovery, and she needed as much evidence as possible. The trail led deeper into the old-growth forest, away from the established hiking paths and into territory rarely visited by humans. Emma moved carefully, her experienced eyes never leaving the trail of massive footprints. The forest grew denser around her, the towering trees blocking out much of the light, creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. The tracks maintained a remarkably straight line, suggesting a creature moving with purpose rather than meandering. Occasionally, Emma would spot other signs. A broken branch far higher than a human could reach, bark scraped from a tree trunk at least 8 feet above the ground, a tuft of what looked like coarse, dark hair caught on a fallen log. She collected each piece of evidence meticulously, storing hair samples in small plastic bags and photographing the other signs. The scientific part of her brain was already thinking about DNA analysis, comparing the hair to known species, consulting with colleagues who specialized in primatology. The less rational part was becoming increasingly convinced that she was tracking something unprecedented, something that shouldn't exist according to mainstream science. After following the trail for nearly a mile, Emma noticed the footprints beginning to fade as the ground became rockier and less receptive to impressions. Eventually, she lost the trail completely at the edge of a small stream where the rocky bed left no tracks. Emma sat on a fallen log, taking a moment to collect her thoughts and review the evidence she had gathered. The implications were staggering. If these prints and the other signs were authentic, and her experienced eye told her they were, then something truly extraordinary was roaming these woods. As she sat contemplating her next move, a sudden silence fell over the forest. The background noise of birds and small animals that had accompanied her throughout her trek abruptly ceased. Emma tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the sidearm at her hip. Years of wilderness experience had taught her to recognize the signs. This unnatural silence usually meant a predator was nearby. She scanned the forest around her, eyes searching the shadows between the massive tree trunks, ears straining for any sound out of place. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest ahead of her, came a sound that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. A low, rumbling growl that was neither bear nor cougar, followed by the distinct crack of branches breaking under significant weight. Emma stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was moving through the underbrush with far less care than before. The rational part of her mind suggested retreating, returning with more equipment and possibly colleagues to continue the investigation. The curious part wanted to move forward, to catch a glimpse of whatever had left those massive tracks. In the end, professionalism won out over curiosity. Emma began backing away slowly, keeping her eyes fixed on the area where she had heard the sounds. She would return to town, review her evidence, and decide on the next steps. This discovery was too important to risk by acting impulsively. As she turned to make her way back to the trail, a flash of movement caught her eye. Something large and dark shifting between distant trees. It was there for only a second. A shadow, moving with surprising grace for its size, and then it was gone. Emma stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, camera forgotten in her hand. Had she really seen something, or was her mind playing tricks, influenced by the tracks and the eerie atmosphere of the post-storm forest? With one last look at the spot where the shadow had disappeared, Emma turned and began making her way back, toward the landslide site and eventually her truck. Her mind was racing, analyzing and cataloging everything she had seen, maintaining the methodical approach that had defined her scientific career. But beneath that professional exterior, excitement was building. This could be the discovery of a lifetime. By the time Emma reached her truck, the light was beginning to fade from the sky. She placed her samples carefully in the secure container. She kept for this purpose, ensuring they wouldn't be contaminated during transport. Her camera and notebook, filled with potentially groundbreaking documentation, went into her waterproof backpack. As she started the engine and began the bumpy drive back to town, Emma knew she stood at a crossroads. The evidence she carried could potentially upend established scientific understanding about North American wildlife. It could also make her a target for ridicule if she couldn't substantiate her findings. The scientific community wasn't kind to those who made extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. Emma decided to proceed with caution. Before going public with her discovery, she would consult with Sean Keller, Elkhorn's most experienced tracker and an old friend whose judgment she trusted. If anyone could help her make sense of what she had found, it was Sean. The lights of Elkhorn came into view as Emma descended from the forested hills. The small town, nestled in a valley surrounded by the vast Olympic National Forest, was just beginning to recover from the storm. Crews were still working to restore power to some neighborhoods, and the main street showed signs of minor flooding. Emma drove past the town center, its handful of stores and restaurants, and headed toward the outskirts where Sean lived. The bye-bye, grizzled tracker had built his cabin on a small piece of land bordering the national forest, allowing him to slip into the woods he loved at a moment's notice. Despite his advancing years, Sean remained active as a guide for both legitimate hunters and wildlife photographers, his intimate knowledge of the forest making him invaluable. She pulled up the gravel driveway to Sean's cabin, relief washing over her when she saw lights in the windows. At least he had power restored. His battered pickup truck was parked outside, another good sign that he was home. Before she could even knock, The cabin door swung open, revealing Sean's weathered face beneath his ever-present Stetson hat. At TUE 67, Sean Keller was as tough as the ancient cedars that surrounded his home. Decades of outdoor living had etched deep lines into his face and turned his skin to leather, but his blue eyes remained sharp and missing nothing. "Thought I recognized the sound of that department truck," he said by way of greeting, a slight smile softening his rugged features. "Was beginning to wonder when you'd show up to check on an old man after that storm." Emma smiled, the familiar banter easing some of the tension she'd been carrying. "Figured you'd outlast us all, Sean. Probably didn't even notice it was raining." Sean chuckled, stepping back to usher her inside. "Coffee's hot if you want some. You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," Emma replied, her voice turning serious as she stepped into the warm cabin. "But something I can't explain, and I need your eyes on it." Sean's expression shifted, the humor fading as he recognized the professional tone in Emma's voice. He gestured toward his kitchen table. "Sit down. Tell me what you found." Emma set her backpack on the table and began unpacking her evidence as Sean poured 2 mugs of coffee black as pitch. She started with the photographs, laying them out in sequence, showing the progression of footprints from the landslide site into the forest. Sean's hands, gnarled from years of hard work but still steady, picked up the first photograph. His eyes narrowed as he studied the massive footprint captured in the image. He said nothing, moving methodically through each photo, occasionally grunting or nodding slightly. "I measured them at 18 inches long, 8 inches wide," Emma said, breaking the silence. "Stride length averaging just over 5 feet. Whatever. Made these was big, Sean. Really big." Sean set down the last photograph and looked up at Emma, his expression unreadable. "Where exactly did you find these?" "Clearwater Basin. About 2 miles in from the east trailhead. There was a massive landslide. I was there to assess the environmental impact when I spotted the tracks crossing the exposed earth." Sean nodded, slowly, processing this information. "And these hair samples?" he asked, indicating the plastic bags Emma had laid out. "Found them on a fallen log in the path of the tracks. Dark, coarse, unlike anything I've cataloged before." Sean picked up one of the bags, holding it to the light. "Too coarse for bear, too long for elk," he muttered, almost to himself. He set the bag down carefully and fixed Emma with an intense gaze. "You know what some folks would say you found," Emma sighed, running a hand through her short brown hair. "I know exactly what they'd say. That's why I came to you first. I need a reality check, Sean. Did I find what I think I found?" Sean leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands wrapping around his coffee mug. For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes distant as if looking at memories rather than the cabin walls. "Let me tell you something, Emma," he finally said, his voice low. "I've been tracking in these woods for over 50 years. Started when I was just a boy, following my daddy as he hunted deer and elk. Thought I'd seen everything these forests had to offer." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "Then, about 30 years ago, after a storm not unlike the one we just had, I found tracks up in the high country. Tracks that looked a hell of a lot like these." Emma felt her heart rate quicken. Sean Keller was not a man given to flights of fancy or exaggeration. If he said he had seen similar tracks, he had. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. "Same as you. Documented them as best I could. Followed them until I lost the trail. Never saw what made them, though I heard things. Strange calls in the night. Breaking branches no normal animal could snap." Sean fixed her with an intense gaze. "Never told anyone except my wife, God rest her soul. Knew what people would say. That old Keller had finally lost his marbles. Or worse, that I was attention-seeking, making up stories. But you believe they're real? That Sasquatch actually exists?" Sean shrugged. "What I believe is that these forests are older and deeper than people realize. That there are places in the backcountry where humans rarely, if ever, set foot. Is it so hard to believe that something could have survived there, away from our prying eyes? Something that's smart enough to avoid us most of the time? Emma considered this. As a scientist, she had been trained to be skeptical, to demand evidence and repeatability. But she was also a field biologist who understood that nature was full of surprises, that new species were still being discovered even in the 21st century. These prints, Sean continued, tapping the photographs, they're the real deal. I've seen enough bear tracks, enough hoaxes too, to know the difference. Whatever made these has weight behind it, has a stride and gait that's consistent. And these? He picked up one of the hair samples. These aren't from any animal officially recognized in these parts. So what do I do now? Emma asked, the full weight of her discovery settling on her shoulders. I can't just ignore this. It could be the zoological find of the century. But if I go public without absolute proof, they'll crucify you, Sean finished for her. Your professional reputation would never recover. Emma nodded, the dilemma clear. As a scientist, she had an obligation to report significant findings. But extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and despite what she had collected, it wouldn't be enough to convince the skeptical scientific community. Sean was quiet for a moment, considering. When he spoke again, his voice had a newfound energy. What you need is more evidence, clear photographs of the creature itself, or even better, video. More footprint casts from different locations. More hair samples that can be tested against known species. And how do I get those without spending years searching the forest? A slow smile spread across Sean's weathered face. You go back to where you found these tracks, with more equipment and an experienced tracker who knows these woods better than anyone. He tapped his chest. I may be old, but my eyes are still sharp. And there's not a creature in these forests that can hide from me for long. Emma felt a surge of excitement mixed with relief. Having Sean's validation of her discovery was one thing, but having his offer of assistance was even better. If anyone could help her find more concrete evidence, it was Sean Keller. When can we start? She asked, her scientific enthusiasm breaking through her professional caution. Tomorrow, at first light, Sean replied without hesitation. Storms cleared out, and if your tracks are as fresh as they look in these photos, whatever made them is still in the area. He gestured to her evidence spread across the table. Pack all this up somewhere safe. Don't tell anyone else what you found. Not yet. Once we have something more substantial, then we can decide who to bring into the circle. Emma nodded, carefully returning the photographs and samples to her backpack. The weight of secrecy settled on her alongside the excitement of the hunt. She was a scientist pursuing evidence, but she was also now party to something that felt almost mystical, the search for a creature of legend in the primeval forests of the Olympic Peninsula. As she prepared to leave, Sean stopped her with a hand on her arm. One more thing, Emma. If we do find what you think you found, if we do get proof that Sasquatch is real— He paused, his expression grave. We need to think long and hard about what we do with that information. These creatures, if they exist, have managed to stay hidden for centuries. There might be a good reason for that. Emma understood the implication. Discovery could lead to protection, but it could also lead to exploitation, to hordes of thrill-seekers and so-called hunters invading the forest in search of a trophy like no other. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, she said, though the ethical questions had already begun forming in her mind. For now, let's just focus on finding evidence. Sean nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. First light tomorrow. I'll be ready. As Emma drove back to her own cabin, the full moon now illuminating the forest road, her mind was filled with the possibilities that awaited her. Whatever she had found in the forest today, be it an undiscovered primate, a case of mistaken identity, or something else entirely, tomorrow would bring her one step closer to the truth. And in the deep, ancient forests of the Olympic Peninsula, something moved through the moonlit shadows, powerful and silent, aware in its own way that the balance between myth and reality was shifting, that its long isolation might soon be coming to an end. Hunt for proof was about to begin, with consequences none of them could foresee. Dawn broke with crystal clarity over the Olympic Peninsula, the storms passing, leaving behind a world washed clean. Emma arrived at Sean's cabin to find the old tracker already loading equipment into his weathered pickup: trail cameras, casting materials for footprints, sample collection kits, and enough supplies for several days in the backcountry. We might need to stake out a spot if the signs look promising, Sean explained, securing his rifle to a rack inside the cab. When he caught Emma's questioning glance, he shrugged. Precaution. These woods have plenty of predators we know about, let alone ones we don't. They drove in companionable silence to the trailhead, the forest awakening around them. The damage from the storm was even more evident in daylight. Fallen trees blocking sections of the narrow road forced them to take detours on logging paths Sean knew from decades of exploring these mountains. Forest'll recover, Sean said, noting Emma's concerned expression as they passed a hillside where several massive Douglas firs had been uprooted. Always does. Been through worse than this storm. They parked at the same spot Emma had used the previous day and began the hike to the landslide site. Sean moved with surprising agility for his age, his eyes constantly scanning the forest floor for signs others would miss. Occasionally he would stop, crouching to examine a bent twig or disturbed moss that Emma hadn't even noticed. You've got good instincts, Sean remarked after Emma pointed out a subtle game trail branching from the main path. Most folks walk right past these signs, even some who call themselves trackers. When they reached the landslide site, Emma led Sean to where she had discovered the first footprints. The overnight rain had softened the impressions, but they remained clearly visible. Massive, unmistakably bipedal tracks pressed deep into the mud. Sean knelt beside the nearest print, his weathered hand hovering just above the impression without touching it. Damn, he whispered, more to himself than to Emma. Even bigger than the ones I found years back. Must be 19 inches at least. He looked up at Emma, his blue eyes intense beneath the brim of his hat. These are the real deal. No hoaxer lugging fake feet would have come this far into the backcountry, especially not right after that storm. They worked methodically, Sean creating plaster casts of the clearest prints, while Emma photographed and measured each one. The scientific part of her brain noted every detail: the 5-toe impressions, the distinctive pressure ridges indicating weight distribution, the consistent stride length that suggested a creature of enormous size moving with purpose. Look. Here, Sean called, pointing to where the tracks led into the forest. See how these branches are broken? 8, 9 feet up. Whatever made these tracks is tall. Real tall. They followed the trail of footprints deeper into the forest, moving, carefully, documenting everything. Sean pointed out signs Emma had missed on her previous day's exploration. Bark rubbed away high on certain trees, what appeared to be territorial markings, areas where moss had been recently stripped away, likely for bedding material. Partially, eaten skunk cabbage plants pulled up by their roots. They're omnivores, Sean explained. Eat pretty much anything they can get their hands on. Plants, berries, small game. Probably fish in the streams, too. They? Emma questioned. You think there's more than one? Sean nodded, pointing to where a second set of tracks, slightly smaller, but similar in shape, joined the first. Family groups, most likely. That's why sightings are so rare. They protect their young, stay away from humans. By midday, they had collected more evidence than Emma had dared hope for. Multiple hair samples from different heights on trees, suggesting creatures of varying sizes. Clear casts of footprints showing distinct individual characteristics. Even what appeared to be fecal matter that could potentially provide DNA. We should set up the trail cameras, Emma suggested, checking the positioning on her GPS unit. If we place them strategically along what seems to be their travel corridor, we might get lucky. Sean agreed, and they spent the next few hours setting up motion-activated cameras at locations where the creatures would be likely to pass, near game trails, water sources, and areas with abundant forage. Each camera was carefully camouflaged and secured high enough that they wouldn't be easily detected or disturbed by wildlife. As the afternoon waned, Sean led them to a small clearing with a commanding view of the surrounding forest. "Good spot to make camp," he said, shrugging off his heavy pack. "High ground, clear sightlines, but sheltered enough that our fire won't be visible from a distance." They set up a simple camp, a small tent for Emma, Sean preferring to sleep under a tarp, stretched between trees. As darkness fell, they kept their fire small, using it primarily for cooking and then letting it die down to coals. The forest at night was a different world, filled with sounds that city dwellers never experienced. The hoot of owls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush, the occasional distant cry that could have been a cougar or something else entirely. "You get used to it," Sean said, noticing Emma's attention to every snap and rustle in the darkness. "Start to recognize which sounds belong and which don't." He sipped from his tin cup of coffee, his eyes reflecting the dim glow of the coals. These creatures, they're most active at dawn and dusk. Crepuscular, you scientists would say. But they move at night too, especially when they want to cover ground without being seen. "You speak like you've observed them," Emma said, curious about how much Sean truly knew. The old tracker was quiet for a long moment, staring into the darkness beyond their small camp. "Seen them 3 times in my life," he finally said, his voice low. "First time I was just a boy, out hunting with my father. Thought it was a bear standing upright at first, until it walked away on 2 legs, smooth as you please." He took another sip of coffee. "Second time was about 30 years ago, like I told you, after that big storm. Got a glimpse of one crossing a meadow at dusk. Massive thing, 7, 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair." "And the third time?" Emma prompted when Sean fell silent. 5 years ago, winter, found tracks in fresh snow, followed them. Shouldn't have." Sean's voice had grown distant, as if the memory still affected him deeply. "It was watching me the whole time. Let me follow until it decided I'd come far enough. Then it showed itself. Just stood there among the trees looking right at me. Could have killed me easy if it wanted to. Instead, it just observed, like it was curious." "What did you do?" Emma whispered. "Stood my ground. Didn't run. Didn't make any threatening moves. After what felt like forever, it just turned and walked away. Left me there. Heart pounding, fit to burst." Sean looked at Emma, his expression grave in the dim light. "That's when I knew for certain. These aren't just animals, Emma. There's an intelligence there, a consciousness." They fell silent, each contemplating the implications of Sean's experience. The night deepened around them, the vast forest seeming to hold its breath. In the early hours before dawn, Emma awoke to Sean's hand on her shoulder, his finger pressed to his lips in the universal signal for silence. He pointed toward the dark tree line, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and wariness. Something was moving out there, massive and deliberate, just beyond the range of clear visibility. Emma could make out only a silhouette, impossibly large, bipedal, moving with a fluid grace that belied its size. A branch snapped under its weight, the sound like a gunshot in the pre-dawn stillness. Sean and Emma remained frozen, barely breathing, as the creature paused at the edge of the clearing. For one heart-stopping moment, Emma felt certain it was looking directly at them, assessing, deciding. Then, with surprising stealth for something so large, it melted back into the forest shadows. "It knows we're here," Sean whispered once he was certain the creature had moved on. "Been watching us all along, I reckon." The revelation should have been frightening, but Emma felt only awe. and a deep responsibility. Whatever these creatures were, they had managed to coexist with humanity, while remaining largely undiscovered. Their continued survival might depend on how she and Sean chose to share their findings with the world. As daylight gradually illuminated the forest, they retrieved their trail cameras with trembling hands. The very first camera revealed what they had hoped for: a clear nighttime image of an enormous bipedal figure, its eyes reflecting the infrared light, an intelligence unmistakable in its gaze. "What now?" Sean asked as they stared at the photographic evidence on the camera's small screen. Emma looked from the image to the ancient forest around them, feeling the weight of discovery and responsibility in equal measure. "Now," she said quietly, "we protect them." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.